other jobs you can get away with, but as a lawyer, it's going to be a pain in your butt. So in terms of your run, I want to talk about that because I want to talk about politics first. So what did you learn from your run for office, right? I mean, because, attorneys are, the district attorneys, that's a political office. A lot of people don't know that. But what did you learn from that process and going through it, even though you were unsuccessful?
Yeah. So what I learned is I didn't really learn that much new in terms of strategy, but it reinforced a lot of the general rules of strategy you already know. So one of the rules is you can't win without money, period. Okay. You can't have a successful race without money. 9 times out of 10, you need a lot of money, which means you need to fundraise, which means you need to be well connected and you need to be out there outsourcing and starting your campaign early. And then 2, the other thing I learned, which was okay, I guess this is a strategic thing I learned. Do what the winners are doing, right? You don't need to reinvent the wheel. And if the winners are doing it successfully time and time again without having to spend a ton of money or spending a ton of money, but also having that infrastructure in place, that can really help aid in your election. So like for my run, one of the issues we had is that here in Utah, even though we're a very Republican state, everything we do is very entrepreneurial. So if you want to run for office, you're kind of on your own. You got to figure it out. You got to buy your own consultant. You have to do all of that. Now, I never hired a consultant, which I don't think made that much of a difference. Everything I was doing was something that a consultant would advise me to do. I made one error kind of in the run that looking back at it, I could have been better at. Pardon?
No. What was the error?
Oh, everybody kept telling me as I was running for this office, DA is a really unique office because, especially here in Utah, where everybody is so compassionate and kind, what they want is they want firmness, but they also want fairness, right? But it's hard when the issue is not front and center in your mind. So, like here in Utah, we had a 46% increase in homicide in the past 4 years. Now, when I would tell that to people, they wouldn't make the connection of DA. So, you have to do a lot of educational work with the public, right? They have no idea what the DA is, how it works, why it's important, and why the crime rate is associated with the amount of prosecution that the DA actually is implementing and the policies of the DA. So, everybody seemed to think that drug dealing was okay and that it didn't matter because it wasn't that big of a problem here in Salt Lake.
Right.
Well, I was down in an area about 8 miles south of Salt Lake City proper, and this is in the suburbs, and this guy was so high as a kite, he was like falling into the street. Now, I started filming him when he was like full zombie mode, just to say, hey guys, like ladies and gentlemen, look, this is happening. You cannot
avoid like meth,
this.
Right? This is like you'd probably meth. And you're talking meth.
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but he was zoned out. So anyway, I see him starting to like walk and I'm like, oh shit. So I put my phone down and I immediately go and like pull him out of the street, start talking to him. Like I didn't know he could have hurt me. He could have been like super psycho. He could have thought, who knows what, right? But instead I just pull him out of the street. I'm like, hey buddy, are you doing okay? Like, where are your glasses? And so we start talking. I help him find his cell phone. He has a bag, and someone else had already called the police because apparently he had already there were already spectators. There were like 6 people just standing there watching him. So the police show up. I sit down with the police and with him, make sure he's all taken care of. We get him all of his stuff. The end, right? I end my video by saying, look, I'm not saying we need to prosecute users. Okay. But drug use, open drug use cannot be normalized and accepted as a viable way of living life in normal society, in a functioning civilized society. This is like unacceptable. And this demonstrates what I've been saying, that drug dealers are preying on the most helpless, the most needy in our society. And this poor man, like he was telling me his friend had just overdosed the week before, right? Because I was like, are you doing okay? What's going on? Okay, so fast forward, I post this video online. Very benign, not spirited or ill-willed at all.
Right.
Just to demonstrate this is real, this is happening. Everybody and their dog started harping on me. You're you're using the homeless for political purposes, and you're just, abusing those who can't help themselves, and da 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 da. So then this whole article comes out on it, like it's some kind of expose, and it turns out the guy's wanted for like 2 crimes in other jurisdictions.
But this happened while you're running, though. This happened while you're running.
This all happened while I was running, but I was made out to be the bad guy. Anyway, I ended up winning 42% of the vote anyway, which is astounding for someone my age. One of the biggest lessons that I learned.
Wait, hold on. Since you said it, what have you disclosed how old you are, Danny? Is that something?
Yeah, no, you can go search it on Google. I'm 32.
Okay. Oh, okay. You're a little bit younger than me. Yeah, that's
yeah. So I'm in terms of like, and the other thing that confused a lot of people is they thought that you had to prosecute felonies in order to be a good DA. I do think it's helpful to have prosecuted felonies so that you understand what your attorneys are dealing with, but it's very much an administrative position. And I think that people have failed to recognize that these policies impact and influence their lives, but that the role of DA is essentially to set out good policy for the office and to kind of keep a standard in terms of what you're going to provide to the public for the public service, right? The service and the standard should be in the interest of justice, right? What is justice? Right. What does that mean? Well, that means, though, that you need to be transparent with the public and talk to them and say, this is why I decided this way on this case. This is why we're not pursuing charges in this case. But it's so bad here, man. We had 200 declination letters that I had to get through grandma requests. These over 200 declination letters were all from like a 6-month period. Almost all of them had to deal with serious drug abuse. We're talking violent crimes like domestic violence cases. All of these cases should have been tried as felonies, almost all. But all the declination letters, which explain the reasons why the DA is not pursuing charges, all said the same thing. In the interest of justice, the state is no longer pursuing charges in this case. That's it. That's it. It wasn't because there was a lack of evidence. It wasn't because a witness wouldn't testify. It wasn't for any of those reasons. Just in the interest of justice, this very ephemeral, nonsensical language that made no sense to the public. And what ended up happening is a lot of people overdosed as a result, because the number one, and I'm not saying this is how it should be, I'm telling you the status of Salt Lake County as is.
But here's one thing I want to get into, Danny, because this is a good conversation, because I vacillate between, and wanting two extremes, right? So one is, okay, either go the route of countries like Japan, China, and Korea and go full everything ban. We're going to go hard on it, severe punishment for everybody, right? It's uniform, and actually enforce that. Or go the other way of Portugal and say, hey, we're just gonna totally, take the reins off, and we're going to collect tax revenue, and we're actually going to gain on this, because right now we're not. And I like, to me, I don't know whether, given the state of our borders, given the state of, how our laws are enforced on a federal level, and particularly how our borders are enforced, which right now are completely porous, I just see increasing state law punishments for any form of drug abuse is just going to be, at best, a Band-Aid, at worst, at worst, it might end some folks up in a place where they shouldn't have been otherwise, right? So whereas they should be in rehab, or they should be somewhere else getting help for their problem, or there should be some underlying look at why they have these dependency problems and why they're getting into these issues. Is it overprescription of pharmaceutical drugs, right? Fix the underlying problem. I'm not convinced after the 80s, right? After the crackdown in the 80s and the fallout from that going hard at a state level is going to change things. But that's my take, right? I've got that too vastly my libertarian interests, right? Because that's where I normally lean, right? That's my normal inclination, versus my like draconian God Emperor, let's go and let's just everybody who commits those sort of crimes, goes to the chair, or whatever else, right? It's a capital sentence. Right. which is how it's treated, by the way, in China. Now, of course, if you look at how it's applied, there's an exception if you're rich, right? So if you're the CCP, if you're rich, if you're wealthy, you get out, which that's not fair, right?
Or if you're well connected. right? If you have the
Exactly.
right friends in the right places.
Right. So those are my two. I would say that's honestly where I go on those issues. I'm like, I can see the logic of both, right? But I just don't think that, let's say that Salt Lake City or Utah makes their laws against drugs tougher. Well, if Colorado, if Nevada, if Arizona, if every single state that's around in the general area of has loosened their restrictions or allowed certain drugs to be consumed, to be possessed without being charged, or crimes, or they're not even chargeable offenses, then how is that going to stop? We don't have any border control when you come into Utah or Florida or Georgia or Texas, right? Yep. So to me, I'm like, I always really think about this. I think about this issue a lot. So I don't know. I want to know if you have a take on that in general.
Oh, no, so do I. As a matter of fact, that's the whole role of the DA, is to balance those interests, right? And they are competing interests. And it's not something that, I think the biggest takeaway. So you were talking about things I learned. One of the things I discussed is the idea that the party has to have an infrastructure to help you win. One of the things that the party failed to do was messaging, consistent, clear messaging to the public. And the Democrats painted me out to be some kind of extremist. And I turned when the sheriff did that to me. At the time, I was a senior policy advisor to a county councilwoman, so I was already very much involved in politics. But when she said that, I turned to her and I said, no, what's really extreme is letting a guy who just beat the shit out of his girlfriend go out of jail without any pretrial conditions. That is extreme.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then not notifying the girlfriend and chalking it up to, oh, well, someone made a mistake somewhere. No, your job as the administrator first, as a public safety official, is to concern yourself with the public safety. Now, after that, though, the policy decisions that you make need to be clearly within the interest of justice. Clearly, it's not just a just result is not mom going to jail and spending time in jail because she failed to get her car registered and her driver's license renewed after her husband, who was abusive, took off on her and she was pulled over on the side of the road with her 3 kids. Okay. That is not a just result that the legal system wants to see, right? Another unjust result would be someone who has a severe addiction that they can't handle, that they can't help because of abuse that occurred to them, when they were young. And they're so deep in it that if you take it away from them, they've lost literally everything in their life and they go and jump off a building as a result. Okay.
Yeah.
Those are not acceptable outcomes.
Agreed.
When I talk about, though, having a standard, it needs to be clear to the public that if you have a certain level of felonies, you are going to be put in jail. That is the reality. And if jail is the worst thing to happen to you in your life, I don't know what else to say. I mean, that's not unfair. If you're out there beating your girlfriend, if you're out there raping kids, if you're out there doing drugs, if you're out there committing serious felony crimes, what do you want me to do? It's the prosecutor's role, not ambition, but role to be sort of that white knight to stand there and say, no, I have to enforce the law. Right. Now, whether or not the jury's going to accept it, whether or not the system can handle the amount of enforcement you're going to give the system is another question. But if you don't start enforcing laws, how do you know a bad law? How do you recognize the negative policy implications to the public if the public is not seeing the effects of those bad laws being enforced? And the role of the DA to lawmakers should be to stand up and say, wait a second, I don't want to be throwing these people in jail. I don't want to be enforcing these laws. Yes, I have the discretion not to, but my discretion only goes so far. I would much rather that instead of you making the law superfluous and meaningless to the vast majority of us, how about you make it fair to everybody? Because what you've done is created a system where I have to play the role of God in every single case.
Yes.
And that's not an appropriate outcome because I'm a human being and I'm going to make mistakes. My prosecutors are going to make mistakes regardless of what policy I put in place.
So okay, I like that, the question of like enforcing law versus not enforcing law, because obviously when I was in Orlando, we had a huge issue where we had Aramis Ayala, who's the, I don't know if you heard about this case, but she came in there. She's a Democrat. She replaced Jeff Ashton, who famously was on personally as the state attorney. He came in and was on the Casey Anthony trial. And when Aramis got in, she said famously, I will not enforce Florida's capital punishments in Orlando and Osceola. I refuse
Not your
to,
call,
because she was a Democrat. She said, and I generally am on the side of that. However, and this is a good transition into the more of the politics conversation, is I think in politics, especially at the national level, we are definitely getting into a tit for tat situation. So it's, you do this, we're going to do this. And what does it benefit us to be the moral high ground and not do this? So for example, if Aramis Ayala is going to go into office and say, I'm not going to enforce capital punishment, when a Republican, or not even Republican, somebody on the right, you could run as non-party. Some jurisdictions for attorneys and judges, they run non-party. So you can run non-party, you could win and just say, hey, I don't believe in these gun restrictions. I believe they're violative of the 2A, the Second Amendment. I'm not going to enforce these. So in my jurisdiction, we're just set a policy to drop them, They exist, but we're just going to drop those cases because, we believe they're unconstitutional and we're not supposed to bring unconstitutional charges. That's part of our duty. So, to drop those. How do you feel about tit for tat? How do you feel about,
I hate it. That's my whole point is, look, if you don't like me if you don't like your super liberal, crazy DAs having as much jurisdiction or as much wiggle room in the law as they do you want me having that jurisdiction now?
Sure.
Right? That's always the question. Whenever you're changing the law as a lawmaker, as a policymaker. So as a law enforcer, your role is very different than a policymaker. Okay. I'm not here to make the law. I'm here to enforce the law as fairly and equally as possible.